Hello and welcome to The Top Story, a podcast with the headlines of the day from our correspondents around the world. I'm Wang Zihang, coming up in this edition. Leaders of the European Union and 6 Gulf nations have met in Brussels amid ongoing turmoil in the Middle East. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have begun the final weeks of their US presidential campaigns, and around 400 participants have discussed tech advancements at the German-Chinese Automotive Conference in Munich. We begin in the Middle East. Qatar has reiterated support for the two-state solution to bring peace to the Middle East. The Gulf Cooperation Council and the European Union have met for their first summit in Brussels as they seek common ground on the conflicts in the Middle East and Ukraine. Qatari Emir Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani and the EU High Representative Joseph Borrell said the two sides agree on the priority of an immediate and sustainable ceasefire, the release of hostages, and a full humanitarian access to civilians in Gaza. EU and Gulf countries also discussed economic and trade ties in Brussels. William Denslow has details.
Top of the agenda will be the conflict in the Middle East, and we heard from Sheikh Tamim of Qatar, who of course holds the rotating presidency of the GCC, and he said in his opening remarks to the leaders gathered here that he didn't want to see war crimes committed in the Middle East become normalized, urging more to be done.
Of course, what's happening in the Middle East, and especially the war on Gaza or the war in Lebanon, has taken a significant time of these discussions. What we have noticed throughout these discussions that there is a very large group of countries, a common agreement basically on that the only way forward for the conflict in the Middle East is implementing the two-state solution. Everyone sees the dire need of the humanitarian situation in Palestine and in Lebanon as well. And, of course, reaching the ceasefire as soon as possible and stop this war.
He praised some European nations that have formally recognized Palestinian statehood, urging other European powers to do the same, saying that more must be done by the EU, imploring them to do what they can to see a two-state solution achieved. Also high on the agenda is the war in Ukraine. European powers will certainly be hoping to see the GCC nations do more when it comes to achieving a degree of isolation for Moscow going forward. But this summit isn't just focused on geopolitics. Trade is another huge area that will be focused on. The EU represents the second largest trade partner for the GCC. 2 years ago, we saw the strategic partnership announced, and Charles Michel, the president of the European Council, says that this summit, which he hopes will be the first of many, he says that it will hopefully, in his mind, achieve a more ambitious chapter when it comes to relations between EU member states and the GCC powers.
That was William Denslow in Brussels. The UN Security Council has discussed the humanitarian crisis in Gaza after Washington gave Israel 30 days to expand access for humanitarian aid in the territory. China's ambassador to the UN says US military aid to Israel has not helped to cool tensions in the region. Jody Jacobs has more from New York.
The situation in northern Gaza was the focus of Wednesday's Emergency Security Council meeting as humanitarians raised the alarm bells about the impact on civilians. The United Nations says Gaza food supply is at breaking point, with aid entering the strip at its lowest levels in months.
There is now barely any food left to distribute, and most bakeries will be forced to shut down again in the next several days without additional fuel. Given the abject conditions and intolerable suffering in northern Gaza, the fact that humanitarian access is nearly non-existent is unquestionable.
But Israel's ambassador to the United Nations emphatically denies there's any lack of aid going into the Gaza Strip. He says over 1 million tons of aid have been delivered, with more than 50,000 trucks, including over 700,000 tons of food. As diplomats met to discuss the unfolding situation, many around the horseshoe table in the Security Council repeated their long-standing calls for an immediate ceasefire. China says repeated discussions on the matter have not amounted amounted to anything. It says this is unacceptable and the Council cannot allow the tragedy in Gaza to continue.
We particularly hope that the United States will respond to the strong call of the international community and support further actions by the Council to bring about any immediate ceasefire. It needs to be pointed out that, according to reports since last October, the United States has provided Israel with more than $17 billion worth of military aid under the current circumstances. Does such a large-scale supply of weapons help to realise the objectives of the Security Council's resolutions? This is a question that needs serious consideration.
Help us.
Riyad Mansour, the permanent observer for Palestine, once again pleaded with the Council to act. He says silence and inaction are no longer an option. There's been no tangible action from the Security Council in recent months other than condemnation. Several Council resolutions, which are legally binding, have for most part gone ignored, leaving the Council in limbo, unable to bring an end to the fighting.
That was Jody Jacobs at the United Nations headquarters. Turning to the Americas, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have entered the final weeks of their U.S. presidential campaigns. Their divergent economic policies contribute to a tighter contest. Owen Fairclough has more from Washington.
Kamala Harris and Donald Trump like to present themselves as polar opposites.
Kamala Harris is the tax queen, and she's coming for your money.
Donald Trump will give billionaires massive cuts, massive tax cuts.
Harris wants the richest to pay more taxes while offering tax breaks to the lowest earners. But Trump is also targeting the lowest earners, including Las Vegas service workers in battleground state Nevada, with a plan to eliminate taxes on tips and Social Security benefits. He also wants to lower taxes for the highest earners, part of a contested conservative economic philosophy that believes wealth spreads from the top down.
Of course, politicians pretty much anywhere in the world standing for election always claim there's something for everyone when it comes to taxation. But Harris and Trump are both tapping into an economic populism to target those crucial blue-collar voters in swing states.
And then there's trade.
Some might say it's economic nationalism. I call it America first.
At a campaign event in perhaps the most critical swing state of Pennsylvania, Trump threatened companies who shift production overseas with huge tariffs. Agricultural equipment manufacturer John Deere, one of the targets.
If you do that, we're putting a 200% tariff on everything that you want to sell into the United States.
Trump's first term was defined by trade battles, including with some of America's most steadfast allies. His administration aiming to protect American jobs through steep import duties.
But the impact of those tariffs has been disputed. Some studies have concluded that they do protect American jobs and manufacturing from overseas competition. But other studies argue that those tariffs backfired on the US by raising prices that manufacturers and retailers either absorbed or passed on to consumers.
Harris thinks it's US consumers who'll ultimately pay the tariffs.
He wants to impose what I call a Trump sales tax on everyday basic necessities, which will cost the average American family nearly $4,000 a year.
But Harris is much less vocal about her position on tariffs as vice president to President Joe Biden, who not only maintained most of Trump's tariffs, but extended them in September with a 100% duty on competitively priced Chinese electric vehicles.
Harris has said she prefers targeted tariffs to protect specific US industries such as electric vehicle and computer chip manufacturing. And it's increasingly clear to US allies that whoever wins the White House, tariffs are likely to shape the next US presidency.
That was Owen Fairclough reporting on the US presidential election. In Asia, Chinese authorities have pledged more support for the property sector, including expanding access for financial loans and increasing those loans. Vice Minister Xiao Yuanqi of the National Financial Regulatory Administration expects the amount of loans for eligible real estate projects to double this year.
I would like to share with you a figure. As of October the 16th, loans for whitelist real estate projects have been approved, totaling 2.23 trillion RMB yuan. It is expected that by the end of 2024, the approved loan amount for whitelist projects will double, exceeding 4 trillion RMB yuan. To ensure the financing of real estate projects and the completion and delivery of houses, we will make sustained efforts to optimize devise such financing mechanism so that all eligible projects can be included into the whitelist, and all loans can be granted, and all those financial support can be delivered as early as possible.
Meanwhile, Housing Minister Ni Hong has outlined incremental measures to stabilize the country's property sector. Yang Chengxi has details of the plan.
China's Minister of Housing and Urban Development, Ni Hong, outlined the country's recent stimulus policies aimed at stabilizing the housing market. These measures include the complete removal or partial easing of purchase restrictions in certain cities, along with reductions in mortgage rates and down payment requirements. Officials stated that the minimum down payment ratio in most cities nationwide has been standardized at 15%. As a key element of the government's support policies, Minister Ni said that China plans to renovate and upgrade 1 million units of urban village housing and unsafe old apartments, and that's building on existing renovation initiatives.
Across 35 cities nationwide, there are approximately 1.7 million housing units throughout urban villages and dilapidated buildings that are in dire need of being renovated. For those types of projects where residents have a strong desire for renovations and safety risks are significant and preparatory work is relatively underway, construction can begin ahead of schedule.
Due to recent slowdowns in the real estate market, many of China's ongoing housing projects have come under increased pressure. In response, officials have outlined financial support measures to ensure the smooth delivery of completed apartments to homebuyers. Specifically, the government plans to include more qualified projects in its real estate whitelist, a mechanism introduced in January, where local governments recommend residential projects to banks for financial support. Officials stated on Thursday that financing for these whitelisted projects will be expedited. Officials noted that because of the new measures, the housing market has shown positive signs in recent weeks, with increased home viewing and sales volumes across many cities. Minister Ni Hong expressed strong confidence that China's housing data for October will reflect this positive trend.
That was Yang Chengxi reporting. Finally, in Europe, around 400 participants are gathering in Munich for the 8th German-Chinese Automotive Conference. Their discussions focus on technological advancements and the growth of German manufacturers such as BMW in China. However, the EU's recent decision to set duties on Chinese-made EV imports has created trade tensions. Earlier, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz explicitly criticized the decision. He pointed out that many countries within the EU do not support the policy, and most car manufacturers also oppose it. Natalie Carney spoke to some participants of the Auto Conference to find out more.
Timing is everything. It's been less than 2 weeks since the European Commission decided to slap duties of up to 35% on imports of Chinese electric vehicles, to the dismay of German manufacturers and suppliers. Now, in its 8th year, the German-Chinese Automotive Conference gives industry experts from both countries the opportunity to discuss global automotive trends and explore avenues to increase cooperation during these uncertain times. The automotive sector makes up around 5% of Germany's economy, and a lot of that has to do with China. According to the Association of the Automotive Industry, about 1 out of every 5 new cars in China bears the logo of a German brand, either imported or built in the country. However, these EU tariffs may shake things up if China, which calls them unfair and unreasonable, pushes back hard.
The main message or takeaway is always cooperation instead of confrontation. That is relatively clear. Germany has so much business in China for the last decades, and now China is moving forward, becoming technology leader in many fields.
I think Europe is somehow behind China, and I think it's a little game change that maybe a European can learn from Chinese.
In line with the theme of this Congress, discussions have also touched on how Chinese EVs can help the European Union achieve its green goals, transitioning away from internal combustion engines by 2035. And that's a major force driving cooperation, regardless of what comes next from the ongoing trade dispute.
It's no secret that China is at the global forefront of the electric vehicle and EV battery industries. Its firms produce nearly 2/3 of the world's EVs and more than 3/4 of EV batteries, which Europe is currently dependent on. China is also spearheading advanced automotive technology.
The German OEM still enjoy nice name, even in China market. You also see the Chinese automotive industry take the lead for the new technology, like autonomous driving, like a cockpit, the smart cockpit, and so on. They are really put a lot of effort in this territory.
Now they are becoming one of the technology leaders. They are not just copying things. The Chinese people did it, think big, start small, scale fast. And if you do it in the wrong way, it could be that you think small, start big, and fail fast.
Beijing has already reacted to the tariffs with provisional duties on EU-made brandy. However, there is concern that this could develop into a bitter trade war, a road neither China nor Germany wants to drive down.
That was Natalie Carney reporting. Now recapping the headlines. Leaders of the European Union and 6 Gulf nations have met in Brussels amid ongoing turmoil in the Middle East. Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have begun the final weeks of their US presidential campaigns, and participants at the German-Chinese Automotive Conference in Munich have discussed tech advancements amid disputes on tariffs for Chinese-manufactured EVs. That's it for this edition of The Top Story, a podcast that brings you world headlines every weekday. For more news in politics, business, sports and culture, you can subscribe to the Beijing Hour, a 1-hour podcast news magazine program. We welcome and appreciate all ratings and reviews. I'm Wang Zihang. Thank you for listening.